Hi, everybody. I'm Ray. I'm an alcoholic from Huntley, Illinois. My sobriety date is November 11th, 1994. I hope you can hear me. It is a pleasure and a privilege to have been invited to participate in this year's McHenry Soberfest. It's not my first, and I'm going to talk a bit about my first when we get going. But it's always a privilege to be invited to do anything in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I want to thank Paul and the committee for reaching out to me and inviting me to come participate. Hopefully some of what I have to say will touch someone. And the topic is at least in some sense working with others, but I think I'm going to try and focus a little bit more precisely in terms of sponsorship, and give something of my own perspective and the sponsorship that I went through getting sober, and also something of a historical perspective of sponsorship that maybe sort of gives a sense about where our roots were and how the development occurred into the 12-step program that we now have and how it's carried forward today. That said, as I mentioned, this is not my first Soberfest. My last drink was November 10th, 1994. And I had it about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and finished the last bottle of vodka I had. And I'd been drinking handles of vodka on a daily basis, well, from handles of vodka on a daily basis for quite a while. And I was scheduled to go and talk to a guy in McHenry. I was living in Galena and staying in Buffalo Grove, and I got a ride out to Galena to McHenry and crawled into a guy's basement there, Tom B. And I hadn't met Tom before. I'd received his phone number from Meredith, the woman who is now my wife and has been my wife for a while, but was not at the time. And she had gotten the number from her Al-Anon sponsor. And she gave me the number and told me if I needed help, I could call this guy at any time. And, you know, it wasn't my first time around Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd been around the table 7 years before. I'd been in treatment in detox, Father's Day of it would have been 87, I guess. And spent a lot of time around your tables for about 3 years, but didn't really open the book and didn't ever really occur to me to ask somebody to sponsor me. So I did what we do and went back out there. You know, I got to Tom's house and I didn't really know what to expect. As I said, I sort of crawled down into his basement because I was still feeling the effects of that last bottle of vodka. And I have notes, so I need to turn to them, and I'm going to read a couple of things, hopefully not too much. But, you know, over the next 2.5 hours, Tom told me enough of his story so that I could identify with him. Found a bit about what I was all about, and I assume he was coming to some conclusion as to whether I fit the pattern of a real alcoholic or not. And he asked me if I was done. And I said I hoped so, but I didn't know whether or not I could quit. And he said, well, we'll take care of that. We'll worry about that together. And he told me what I could expect from him and told me what he expected from me. And then gave me some specific directions of what he expected me to do beginning the next day. And the first of those was quite obviously not to pick up a drink the next day. The following week, I did what he had asked me to do. I picked up the phone every day and called him. I went to a meeting every day, got down on my knees in the morning and asked God for help not to pick up a drink. Actually didn't drink, and I began to read the big book. He'd asked me to read the foreword to the first edition and the doctor's opinion and Bill's story, and I got through that. That next weekend, the 18th, 19th, and 20th was, if my arithmetic is right, the 5th Soberfest. My math may be off there. And thanks to my current wife's Al-Anon group, they had an extra seat at the table at the banquet that Saturday night. So I attended that Soberfest, not looking any too well, not feeling any too well, and sober for 7 days. And all I remember actually of the event is sitting at that banquet table with my wife's Al-Anon group and one other guy, Eddie, and I thought Eddie only spoke Polish. I met him again several times and he became a good friend and he spoke more than Polish, but all I could remember was sitting there watching every eye on me, or I was sure every eye was on me as I lifted that first cup of coffee and tried to get it to my face. The weekend was a great weekend, what I remember of it. And it may have been Richie who may have been the chair that year. He may not have, but I seem to recall him up there at the podium. Richie H. The following weeks, for a couple of weeks, I went through, I went through the readings that Tom asked me to do, picked up the phone every day, called him, and the weekend of December 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, so about 2 weeks after Soberfest, he told me to bring a toothbrush and a change of underwear to his house, and I went through steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and on Sunday morning, I was making calls to set up meetings to make amends to people that I owed them to. The long and the short of that story is that was my introduction to sponsorship. The step work that Tom did with me ended after I went through 10, 11, and 12 with him, and I'd made some amends by that time, and I was moving forward. And at one point, I was meeting with Tom, and we were probably done with the 12th step, and he said something to me that still I remember, and I hope maybe he does too, and that was, go with God, he'll find something for you to do. And at first, I didn't have any idea. Well, I had no clue what he was talking about. And what he was doing was telling me that I had accepted an invitation into a spiritual dimension. My life was no longer mine. My time was no longer mine. The plan was no longer mine. And I've come to understand more about that in terms of those elements, that spiritual dimension we now have in our lives, through the sponsorship of other men. And needless to say, I forget. From time to time, I forget. And I take back the reins for short periods of time, and it usually doesn't go well. But I guess the background to all of what I've said to this point is I should let you know that I've done some historical work. I've served as the archivist in Northern Illinois, and history's always excited me and interested me in the past, even before I became a member of AA. I learned that my sponsorship chain, if you will, with Tom in 94, began with Tom in 94. Prior to Tom, Tom had gotten sober down in Florida, and a guy named Mark M. took him through the steps down there. At least that's my understanding. Mark had gone through the steps in Florida with a fellow named Clarence Snyder, whose story is the Home Brewmeister and was in the first edition of the first big book. And Clarence was sober thanks to the work of Dr. Bob in Akron. So I trace my sobriety line and my sponsorship line pretty much back through the Ohio bunch. And in that sense, I guess some of what I'm going to talk about has more to do with Ohio, but I don't think it does. I think, our program is our program, and prior to the steps being written down in the book by Bill, and I think the programs both in New York and Ohio were pretty much running along the same lines, but there were some variations, but I just throw that out as a caveat. My understanding is that the first 164 pages of the big book provide us with clear-cut directions, showing exactly how the earliest members recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind, body, and spirit. We have that book, and we're blessed to have that book and that program. Chapter 7, Working with Others, shows us or shares with us their experience in how they approached others, and how the steps, the things they learned, and the mistakes they made in terms of offering that solution to others. And I guess it's in that I want to take a little bit of a look at what was going on in Ohio, and prior to that, when Bill finally got sober. And so moving in that direction, Um, the, you know, looking back from my sobriety date, November 11th, 1994, about, I guess it would be 60 years to November 11th, 1934, an armistice day when Bill started his last drunk. He'd been out of towns for a couple of months from the previous trip that he'd made there. And he decided it was a nice day and he was going to go play some golf on Staten Island. So he grabbed, I guess he grabbed his clubs and got on a bus and he sat down next to a guy. And I guess the trip at the time from where they were was bus, boat, and then a bus out on Staten Island, a ferry, and then a bus. And that first bus broke down or had a minor accident of some kind, and they got off the bus, and the guy and Bill went into what must have been a pub or a bar or something at the time, Prohibition, I guess, whatever, speakeasy. And Bill didn't have a drink, but the guy had a drink or a beer, and Bill explained to him that he was an alcoholic and one of those kind that can't manage even one drink. And that he was through forever with it. He wasn't going to drink again, and very carefully explained to the guy the concept of the illness that he suffered from. You know, they took this ferry boat ride, and they decided they were going to stop for lunch. And having lunch where somebody, apparently they were serving alcohol, the bartender, and Bill describes it this way: the bartender, a big blonde Irishman, came abreast of us beaming. In each hand he held a drink. "Have one on the house, boys," he cried. "It's Armistice Day." Without an instant's hesitation, I picked up the liquor and drank it. My friend, now he's a friend, looked at me aghast. "My God, is it possible that you could have a drink after what you just told me? You must be crazy." And my only reply could be, "Yes, I am." Bill suffered that November probably some of the worst drinking that he had suffered. And it was partway through that month that Ebby shows up at his door. And Bill's sort of hesitant to even let him in because he didn't know if he had enough booze for Ebby, and he knew Ebby had drank like he did. But Ebby arrived at Bill's house with a different message. Ebby didn't look the same. And we know that story. I'm not going to go through that story in any great length. But Bill understands from Ebby that he's found a solution, that there is a solution to this deal, at least to the extent that Ebby was able to share it with him. And on December 11th, a month after he picked up that drink, you know, on the way to Staten Island, Bill goes into towns for the last time. And he's on the way, he picks up 4 bottles of beer for the trip from the house apparently to Towns Hospital. His mom pays for the stay at the hospital, so I guess Bill had money for the beer, but not the hospital bill. The only reason I mentioned that because it makes me look pretty good, because I didn't buy my booze on the way to Tom's house when I finally got sober. I was just finishing the booze that I had in the house, so I guess it was my philosophy was more waste not, want not at the time. Bill finished those beers and you know, Ebby returns to Towns, and we know that story too. Bill suffers from an incredible depression hearing from Ebby, and this is what Ebby tells Bill, and again, I want to read this. Ebby tells Bill he had to admit, 1, you're licked. 2, get honest with yourself. 3, talk it out with somebody else. 4, make restitution to the people you've harmed. 5, give of yourself without stint. And 6, pray to whatever God you think there is. That language, by the way, I picked up in a box 459. That's a publication by AWS. It's the April-May one of 1991, and it's in an article curiously entitled "Sponsorship, Is It Disappearing?" And the only reason I mentioned that is because, thank God, for a guy like me, a guy like Tom B was still willing to take guys through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in order that I might be able to then get sober and carry that message as well. It is all about us carrying the message. And I think that's what I learned from even the earliest, even from Ebby. It is all about the notion that it is not our time. It is not our plan. Bill's plan was to continue to drink. When he went back out there after that boat ride, that ferry ride to Staten Island, and picked up a drink, his plan was to continue to drink, and he was continuing to drink himself close to death. On December 15th, Ebby returns to visit Bill, and in the story, Bill relates, I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I'd hurt or toward whom I'd felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to right all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Those are our steps. Bill from Ebby got that, not just the gift of sobriety, but also the gift of sponsorship and the gift of sponsorship for the rest of us. Bill left Towns immediately and began immediately to try and work with other alcoholics, and he ran into some problems. He delivered this message. Bill had had this white light experience in the hospital, this spiritual experience that he was describing to everybody he could find, both at Towns Hospital and Calvary Mission. And Bill had absolutely no success doing it. And he reached out to Dr. Silkworth at Towns and asked him what he thought the problem was. And Silkworth told Bill, what you need to do is break down the egos of alcoholics. You're telling them about this spiritual experience you've had, but their ego is such that they don't understand the obsession notion and the allergy that condemns them to continue no matter what. And he said, I suggest, and these are Silkworth's words, pour it right into them about the obsession that condemns them to drink and the physical sensibility or the allergy of the body that condemns alcoholics, one alcoholic talking to another. Maybe that will crack it. And, you know, there's where Bill picks up the notion of the spiritual solution. Less than a couple of months sober, he's got a message from Silkworth, and at this point, the next alcoholic he deals with is Dr. Bob. On May 1st, Bill takes off for Akron. We know that story. I'm not going to go into that story. He's going for purposes of business. It's a corporate takeover. It falls through, ends up badly. Bill's pacing the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and he needs to reach out to another alcoholic. So he makes a series of phone calls. And through those phone calls, he reaches out and ultimately finds Henrietta Seiberling. And she says, I've got one for you. Come on over to my place tomorrow. And Bill meets up with Dr. Bob at the Seiberling mansion. And again, that story we know. That story is one in which Bill uses that approach that Dr. Silkworth had suggested to him, uses the approach of breaking Dr. Bob down and telling him that there is now a cure for what ails Dr. Bob. Now, Dr. Bob later remembers that the notion of the scientific approach, the medical approach, really didn't have as much impact on him as the mere fact that Bill was able to explain to him, and these are Dr. Bob's words, he was the first living human being with whom I ever talked, who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up in his reading. What Dr. Bob is highlighting for us is that notion of one alcoholic talking to another can cut through all of the ego, all of the depression, the alcoholism of one alcoholic. The cure for that alcoholism, the solution for that alcoholism is best carried from one alcoholic to another only after that opportunity for identification. And that's where sponsorship, at least in my mind, begins. That's what Tom offered to me, was a sense of identification, one alcoholic with another. You know, I was going to reach right into the Bill Dotson story and go right to AA number 3, but that would display a false sense of where Bill and Bob were at the time. Dr. Bob and Bill knew that they had to reach out to another alcoholic. Bill stayed on in Akron, largely at Ann Smith's request, and stayed with Bill and Dr. Bob at the Smith home. And the first alcoholic that they actually encounter is a fellow named Eddie Yar. And Eddie's story is one that appears in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, but it's not one that makes it into the big book, because Eddie didn't get sober. And again, not my plan, not my time. This is God's plan and God's time. And Eddie is referred to Dr. Bob. He's a neighbor living up the street in a rented house, he and his family, and he's referred to Dr. Bob, probably through Ann, by a minister. And the minister suggests that Eddie would be an ideal candidate since Dr. Bob is now making this effort to reach out to alcoholics. Eddie has a decent job, but he loses that. They're renting a house, they lose that. And the Smiths Ann invites them and their kids to move into their house on Ardmore Street. So we have Eddie and his family, Bill, Dr. Bob, and Ann and Dr. Bob and their kids, and Bill living at Ardmore. And you know, the best thing to tell you about Eddie is he is a piece of work. Bill writes to Lois a letter in which he describes Eddie at the moment in Bill's way of thinking. He says, Bob and I started to work on this chap a week ago Wednesday, got him sober. He and his wife made a surrender. He began witnessing to his creditors and is changing very rapidly. Eddie was an alcoholic, but also an atheist, and Bill thought he would create a great sensation if this atheist would recover using this spiritual means. He continues in the letter to Ann. Sunday came, and for the first time, he ate heavily. The result was actually temporary depression mania. He rushed away to commit suicide. This is the story in which Eddie heads up to Cleveland from Akron, drunk, and is threatening suicide. He calls, and Bill and Bob talk to him, and he's in Cleveland. He's found a good dock to jump off of, he says. And Bill in his letter to Ann says, the next day he called from Cleveland to bid me goodbye, having found a good dock to jump from, but having found himself unable to do it without first calling me. I advised him to drink some more and permit me to come up and see him before he did anything. So he tore over to Cleveland in the middle of the night and got him at a hospital and commenced the town's treatment. Bill writes another letter that's almost as hopeful to Lois, but Eddie does not get it. Eddie is not able to get the message from Bill and Dr. Bob. He actually takes off after Ann at one point with a butcher knife. And Ann tells the story of how she drops to her knees and begins praying, starts with the Lord's Prayer and then others. And in Ann's words, she basically says, I kept my voice low in a monotone. I figured sooner or later I was going to bore him. And Eddie is finally Bill comes up and talks him out of the knife. And it's this event that really convinced Bill and Dr. Bob that they probably aren't going to be able to work with Eddie much longer. Eddie's story, the reason I sort of beat it up a little bit here and is again, not our plan, not our time. Years later, Dr. Bob is speaking at a big AA event at a country club in Youngstown, Ohio, and Eddie comes up to him and says hello to him, and he says, Eddie, holy cow, it's you. Eddie's sober a year again in 1950 at Dr. Bob's funeral. So Eddie did the best he could. He was a member of the Youngstown, Ohio group at that point. And, you know, we talk an awful lot about the folks who make it into the big book. We talk an awful lot about our successes when we talk about sponsorship. But I have to tell you, over the years that I've sponsored men, at one point I sat down and started counting, okay, how many guys have I gone through the steps with? I probably came up to a dozen and a half or maybe a few more. It was a few years ago. And you know, I could count at least twice that number with whom I had started out and who had either disappeared or walked away or had gone part of the way through and then went back out. You know, it's not my job to cure anybody as a sponsor. And I think that's what Bill and Dr. Bob were realizing early on in the process, that they needed to work with alcoholics. And one of the things they came to realize, and one of the things our book suggests to us, is that as Tom asked me, are you done? We need to be willing to say, yes, we are. You know, Bill Dotson, the next alcoholic they turn to is Bill Dotson. Bill's story is AA number 3. And again, I'm not going to go through that, but you know, in Akron, they had a form of sponsorship and a procedure that grew over time, starting, right after Bill left and through into the early 40s even. It was not unusual at all for someone to interview the wife of an alcoholic. The early alcoholics were all men in Akron. And then hospitalization was almost automatic. Clarence Snyder was one of the first and one of the youngest alcoholics. And in Clarence's case, Dr. Bob turned to him and said, I'm not sure that you're going to get this. You're just too young. You haven't suffered through the hopelessness and the drinkings that some of the rest of us did. But in spite of himself, Clarence got sober. When a newcomer came into the program after hospitalization, they'd go into the hospital, and a number of Akron members would go into them and talk to them and share their story, share their experience, basically to provide them with a basis for identification. Dr. Bob would meet with every one of these guys and tell them the hopelessness of their condition as a real alcoholic, the medical problem, the medical nature of the disease. And you know, this process of taking men then through the steps was one that occurred even when the Oxford group, when the Akron AAs were still meeting as members of an Oxford group meeting. They would take that newcomer upstairs, and Dr. Bob or one of the other members would, or a couple of the men would sit with him and ask him to surrender on his knees to God and to ask God for help to get sober. The process was one that was ironed out in the early years in that way in Akron. You know, the one member that I do want to just touch on because of a couple of things is Earl T. Earl T gets sober. He comes out of Chicago. He's referred to the Akron bunch and to Dr. Bob in particular. And Earl takes until about July when he shows up and he basically goes through the process that I sort of outlined for you. And the day before he leaves for Chicago, Dr. Bob takes him through what Earl describes as a 6-step program and writes it in his story. And, you know, those 6 steps, as Earl writes them, are complete deflation, dependence and guidance from a higher power, moral inventory, confession, restitution, and continued work with others. Ebby's direction to Bill as to what he had to do used almost exactly that same language and almost exactly those same 6 items in a somewhat different order, but nonetheless, the program, the process in Akron was beginning to take form even before we had the book. You know, I've got a bit more time, and the break then, okay, why sponsor others? Well, Bill writes that his friend Ebby, in the first meeting with him, emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. From Bill's story, particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life, enlarge his spiritual work and life with spiritual work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. If he did not work, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead. Dr. Bob says, I spend a great deal of time passing out what I learned to others who want and need it badly. In his story, he lists 4 reasons: sense of duty, a pleasure, because in so doing, I pay my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me, and because every time I do, a little more insurance for myself is taken out for myself against a possible slip. And in working with others, Bill wrote, practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other things fail. You know, the bottom line for me, I guess, is what those guys were doing back in that period, you know, is exactly what Tom was doing with me. We have the advantage of a book, and the book lays out for us those things that we need to do and shows us the example of those who came before us. The process for me is one that, I basically do what Tom did, I think, in a very real sense. In some sense, time maybe has changed it a little, but the book tells us, see your man alone if possible. That's at page 91, and I do that. Typically, prior to the current pandemic, I would usually meet him at a Panera prior to, my home group meeting, or prior to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. The book tells us, provide a sketch of my drinking, the basis for identification. It says the more hopeless he feels, the better. So I do talk about the disease of alcoholism. The book also tells us, if you determine in talking to this guy, getting a sense of his background, dwell on the hopelessness, let him draw his own conclusion and ask how he can get well. And that seems to have some effect on most guys who are done or want to be done. I've had the opportunity of working with men and women, men in terms of sponsorship, but men and women in terms of service sponsorship. But in terms of sponsorship, I've worked with Christians, I've worked with Catholics, I've worked with a Jew, a Muslim, I've worked with agnostics, and I've worked with atheists. For me, it is as important, one thing that has been as important as any other, and I think our founders did this as well, and that is to hold the door open as widely to the spiritual aspects of our program, to bring them into the program in a way that allows them to find the power greater than themselves, upon which they can rely. In doing that, I think it allows those who have the desperation that I had to seek out help by picking up the phone for the first time, or walking up to somebody at a meeting that they've gone to for the first time and asking, hey, can you help me? That's probably the first spiritual act that I took in a long time, picking up the phone and calling that number of a guy that I didn't know and asking him for help was probably the first effort I made to reach out to another human being from that state of isolation that I had brought myself to. Closing, I guess I want to suggest to you some things that Tom, as I recall it, and he may say otherwise, but he asked me 3 questions in that first night. And to the best of my ability, and it wasn't great at the time, I have to admit that, he asked me, are you done? And he told me why. He said, if you're not, I have better things to do. I have others to work with. I thought he was sort of a nasty guy, and that was at least rather rude, but I've come to realize that if they're not ready, there's not much I can do. The book tells us that. He asked me, are you willing to go to any length to get sober? And I asked that of the guys that I sit down with. And I remind of it on a regular basis. Because Tom said, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I haven't already done. And I will walk through this with you. And I say the same thing to the guys that I sponsor. And he asked me, can you just not drink tomorrow? And I said, I'll try. And that was the best I could say at that point. The other thing that Tom did, that, at the time I didn't know what to make of it. And I now consider them 3 promises. He he told me I never had to drink again. And I said something wise to him because as I said, I'd been around the tables for a while. The first time around, I hadn't bothered to pick up the book, but I'd heard people say, it's a one day at a time program, And what Tom said to me was, well, you need to read the book. And I'll tell you this, if I was doing this on a day-to-day basis, one day at a time for the rest of my life and looking at it that way, I'd probably go out and get drunk on that basis alone. But, he pointed out a couple things to me at that point. He showed me, Dr. Bob says, if you really and truly want to quit drinking liquor for good and all, and sincerely feel you must have some help, we know that we have an answer for you. Bill writes in chapter 7 on page 90, let his family ask him if he wants to quit for good and if he would go to any extreme to do so. That's exactly the path. That's exactly the opportunity that Tom was offering me. It's exactly the opportunity that I offer to the newcomer who asks me if I'm willing to sponsor him. Tom also promised me, you can live a life that's happy, joyous, and free. And at that point, as I was sitting in his basement, half drunk, just starting to feel the point where the alcohol was wearing off, I didn't know the meaning of any of those words. I didn't know what they meant. I do today, but I had no clue what he was talking about. And I just sort of shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. And then he said something to me that I still remember. And I say to other guys, you can become the man you were meant to be. The son, the husband, the partner, the father, the sibling, the employer, the employee, the member of society. You can become useful. And I didn't know how much impact that had on me. And I didn't know how much impact it had on other guys when I first sat down with them and told them something like that. But subsequent to that, I had heard one of the guys that I sponsored say it at my home group, and I heard another guy say it from the podium. And I realized that that's really all we're looking for. That's really all we're looking for, is a life where we can have some use. As a sponsor, as I said, I do the best I can to hold the door wide open. I share our program of recovery as it's set out in the big book. And I offer opportunities to others. I offer an example of how they can be of some use. The process for me is one in which I offer as a sponsor a walk with me that I took with somebody else to move from a state of drunkenness to freedom, from desperation to hope, from isolation to love. That spiritual dimension is one that I can't muster up alone. The skill, the courage, the anything to really be able to present to somebody else. But with your help, with God's help, I can offer that, because I know today that I'm sitting here sober as a result of something that a guy carried to me. Thanks, everybody. That's what I got. And I appreciate the opportunity to present it. And I hope a few of you got something out of it. That's all I got.